Dr. Jeff Ramsey studied social studies and has PhD in history from Boston University. He is a former principal at Lehigh Academy, a lecturer at Toronto College of Education from 1991 to 1992. He was also a deputy senior private secretary and press secretary to the president of Botswana 2003 to 2007. He was a coordinator at Government Communication Systems Office of the President 2007 to 2009. Deputy Permanent Secretary for Media, Ministry of Communication, Science and Technology. He is a chairman of board and vice principal at Livingston Gulbenkian College. He is the founding chair of the Kgari Sechele Museum. Dr. Ramsey is a well-known historian in Botswana. His publications include Historical Dictionary of Botswana, Comrade Fish, Memoirs of African Fighter in the Botswana Underground, Building a Nation, A History of Botswana 1800 to 1910, The Making of a President Sekitu Masiri's Early Years, Birth of Botswana, A History of Botswana Land Protectorate from 1910 to 1966, as well as numerous articles. Welcome to Shining the Light. My name is S.E. Waleboa, and my guest today is one and the only, Dr. Jeff Ramsey. How are you, Doctor?
I'm feeling great. We've been having a good time. We had a great time this past weekend in Pelikwe, celebrating the legacy of Cecil Khama and the village's 78th anniversary. So, yeah.
Yeah.
Good stuff.
Yeah, but was there a lot of people in Pelikwe?
Yeah, I mean, certainly for Pelikwe, I'm sure it was a lot of people. But we had
are there a lot of Bahero there?
Yes, I was going to say we had people from Namibia, South Africa, and we had the paramount of the Ovaherero. So it was a good gathering, absolutely.
Wow.
But we also had Dikosi, Dikosana, princesses and the likes from South Africa. So very representative.
Right. I saw you had a big presentation over there.
We tried.
You always produce great work. But let's talk about, because for the past 2 weeks we've been going through the pandemic. So I just want to know how you've been dealing with the pandemic, because a lot of us, or a lot of people were affected by this, So it seems like we're seeing a light at the end of the tunnel, though.
I hope so. And I think part of it's in our minds. I mean, I'm not negating what it was, because I've lost, acquaintances, friends. I had it myself before I was vaccinated. It wasn't pleasant. So I'm not saying that it in any way it was a small thing, but I think it's important that our own mentality say we can't just live in the fear for the rest of our lives. We have to face this COVID. We have the tools now, and we need to get on with life.
Right. No, it's not a pleasant experience. I had it when I was vaccinated, and it was tough. And so it was tough. So, Doctor, the Queen just died. Should the Africans mourn her passing or celebrate her demise regarding the brutality and the nature of colonialism and imperialism? I mean, I guess we're human beings. Maybe we should sort of kind of still, give us sympathy.
Well, I think she was an icon. And in that sense, because she was an icon, I think it's valid for people to react in different ways to the icon. I mean, I don't think we should celebrate her death, but I wouldn't blame people if they don't want to join the celebration.
Right.
I myself am not a monarchist, and I'm certainly no fan of the British Empire. I did respect her, though. I wrote my little bit because I respected the public persona she projected. And she was a queen who presided over the end of the British Empire and the transformation of the Commonwealth. And I think she did that role. It's a ceremonial role. It's not a political role per se. It's got a behind the scenes political role. But I think she played her role very well for 70 years. So I respected her. Plus, it's just a matter she was there forever. She had been on the throne for many years before I was born, and I'm not a young person. In fact, my mother was a school child when she was coronated. So when you think about
so when did she start? Like 1952 or
52?
Yeah.
She ascended to the throne 52. So she ruled for, I think it's 70 years and 8+ months.
Mm. Mm. Wow. So, but you were saying
But
that
I
when you
mean,
think about it,
well, I mean, different people can react. If some people want to use this milestone as a way to discuss the British Empire, its atrocities, or whether there should be republic or this or that, the class system, I think all that's valid. People should have conversations. I wouldn't put it all on her shoulders, but then again, like I say, she's a symbol, so symbols are lightning rods for discussion.
right? Let's go back and talk about your where you were born and how you ended
Uh,
up in.
yes, I was born in the great port city of Baltimore,
Okay,
in the
okay,
U.S.
okay.
of A.
Yeah, of course.
And I spent most of my childhood there. I was in Chicago for a while
Mhm.
because my father was in graduate school and the like. So we floated around a little bit. And then I went to university, undergraduate in Philadelphia at Penn. And then the real connection started with Botswana when I went to graduate school. And within a few months, I met my wife, Sakabo. She was going to Northeastern. So, I mean, I was already into African studies. I had been to Southern Africa once.
I want you to continue. Let me. So, there's a saying that say that whoever finds a wife finds a good thing. So,
Yes. Anyway, I mean, she's been the anchor. At some point in our lives, we had to decide where we will be, where we can make the biggest contribution in our life.
okay.
And we had spent time in each other's country. And so then the decision in 1984 basically was we're settling in Botswana.
Wow.
So
So you've been in Botswana since when? What year
since
was that?
1984, except for I did leave for a couple years. She got her master's, and I wrote up my
Mm,
doctorate and did some teaching at Harvard and at Boston. But that was for a couple years while I finished my doctorate and she did her master's.
yeah.
So otherwise, we've been in Botswana.
Yeah. So you got there when Masiri was still the president at that time.
Oh,
So
absolutely. I got there when they had the by-election after the Siamo ballot box. They were having the by-election, and there was excitement about that. So
yeah,
that was the first political thing I remember. Plus, the private press was very new then. The
right,
Guardian and the Mehi and the Gazette was soon to be there too, I think. So
yeah,
that was also something that was shaking the environment. That Dr. Khama, of course, won the by-election. There was this new press that was making
right,
everybody uncomfortable at the time.
right.
Um, and then at the university, it was very dynamic at that time. I was affiliated with the university as a research associate.
Uh-huh.
At that time, we had Michael Crowder had taken over the department because Tom Flo was now heading the university,
Right.
and but you had Flo and as
Hmm.
and Michael Crowder was in there, and he was keeping going this very dynamic seminar, which they
Right.
used to have, where students would write their own theses, doing original research for their
Right.
BAs. And so I got to sit in on that, be part of that, and that was also very exciting.
There's got to be a point where you said, you know what? I love the history of Botswana or history in general, but this is what I'm going to be doing. When I was in high school, now I realize some of those books that were not even written by the people who knew the history of
Yes,
Botswana, but we were tested on those books, you know.
yes. No, I was surprised, and my big life frustration has also been my big life motivation, which is
Mm,
that indeed Botswana history has not, when we talk about schools and public institutions, it has
mm,
not lived up to the challenge of Seretse Khama,
mm,
the infamous challenge he gave in 1970 at the graduation of then University of Botswana, Swaziland, Lesotho still,
mhm.
where he talked about the need to recapture the past. A nation without a past is a nation without a soul.
Right.
All of that was a very big clarion call. And it was at the time not a shocking call because post colonial Africa, there was rewriting of history, rediscovery of history across the continent. So at that point, Botswana was not necessarily unique. But I must say, I'm disappointed with what the Ministry of Education in particular has done in the decades since. It seems like social studies, which was supposed to be a step moving forward, was a step backwards. So it's kept me going. It's motivated me, and I think we're getting somewhere with it. But
Yeah.
you won't have history well. The type of consciousness of history and broad-based understanding and debate if you don't teach it in your school system and teach it with some detail. And it's a matter of if you
With
are
the real substance.
yeah, I mean, there's going to, well, I'll put it this way. When I grew up in the States, I got different levels of history through my career. I mean, at primary school, we got one level of history. It was not entirely uncritical. We had Black History Month. We knew about slavery and Native Americans. Of course, being children, we might not have fully grasped the atrocities. By high school, we were being encouraged to be much more, challenged by American history. And of course, when you get to university, and almost everybody then, even I did some major in history as well as media, but anybody who majored, even who didn't major, very often took an introductory American history class, American History 101, so to speak. And there you had criticism, and free flowing debates. That's the way I think national history should be taught. Really, in any country, that's the model. You want to introduce it, get the facts down, and encourage debate, because history is a debate, but you can't have a debate if you don't know basic facts.
Correct. No, I just love your dedication. I love your dedication, and I think you're producing really great work. But let's go back to let's now talk about the issue here, the protectorate and the colony and the possession. Let me put this way. We were told that we were protected, right? Yes, we were told that we were protected. So,
well, this is a complicated question in a way. Now, Botswana, first of all, the protectorate was imposed in January 27th, 1885, although it was gazetted in March 31st. So you can play around with the dates. In between that time, the Brits and the Germans in Berlin, because the Berlin Conference was ongoing, were drawing lines on the map between Namibia and southern Botswana while discussing northern Botswana.
That's like 1885.
1885, yeah. This whole process, initiated 1884, 1885. The reason Botswana was occupied by the British and a protectorate proclaimed was a tit for tat vis-a-vis the Germans. They did not want the Germans to move into Botswana. They wanted to keep Botswana as a highway, a road to the north, as a strategic possession, and also make sure that the Germans in Namibia were separated from the Boers in the Transvaal. So at that point, no, Dekosi had asked for protection. And indeed, Sechele chided the British when they came to inform him of the protection that, he had read some newspapers where it said that he and Khama had asked for protection and he doesn't know anything about this. And it goes on. So what is a protectorate? Well, when the British came, of course, they were happy to say, well, don't you need some protection from something? But in that context, and in particular,
so let's put the Kosi never asked for protection.
No.
Yeah.
Not before the protectorate was established. They later asked for protection from Cecil Rhodes.
Right.
10 years after the protectorate.
Right.
But at that point, now there is some discussion whether Khama wanted a protection in 1870s because there was some Doorslaan trekkers. I don't think Khama, if you look at the material Khama's making any kind of desire known for occupation by the British, the Doorslaan trekkers were coming from then British occupied Transvaal. So he's basically telling the Brits, keep them out of my country. Sechele went to the Cape in 1853. Some people have tried to interpret that as an appeal for protection, but Sechele rejected that altogether and explicitly, saying, he had come simply to point out that the Sand River Convention was unfair, that some of his people had been enslaved by the Boers, and that the Brits were not allowing him to buy guns and ammunition, but they were allowing the Boers to buy guns and ammunition. So that was the entire issue there. So no, I mean, to make a long story short, no Decosi had asked for protection. Now they knew they had to basically acquiesce to it to a certain extent in 1885. They had watched the British massacre the Batlaping in the 1870s when they took the diamond fields, and they would do so some more in the 1890s. Sechele at one point in 1865, he and Hasatsiwe and Manshiwa had threatened the Boers with renewed war if the Boers did not back off from their plan to seize Baharutsi lands, Behorutsi. And the Boers did back off. And then he was asked about that time, would you do the same thing with the British? And he said, no, the British lion would swallow me in a day. So he was practical. The power of the Boers was nothing compared to the power and the might of the industrial British Empire with its machine guns and everything else. So what happened? Well, Warren was sent up after the Protectorate was proclaimed to inform Kings, Sechele, and Khama. The word Kings was used, and it was confined initially to Sechele and Khama. They were recognized as the two important rulers that Britain should inform about the Protectorate. And they were informed, and the Batswana said, well, we're not sure about it, after haranguing Warren for a day and a half. But Khama embraced the Protectorate. That's two strategies. But by the end of the Warren expedition, all the Decosi had acknowledged the Protectorate. And that was that for the time being. Now, in the initial years, it wasn't much of an issue, but things changed dramatically in 1889 because Cecil Rhodes got his charter, and Cecil Rhodes envisioned Botswana being part of his domains. He not only envisioned it, he was given it by the Queen in the charter.
Right.
And he himself had put off the administrative transfer because he had Sidney Shippard, my infamous Morena Maaka, doing his bidding while being paid for by the Brits, while he could devote his resources to conquering the Vashona and the Amandabile in Zimbabwe. Cecil John Rhodes was one of the most powerful men to have lived, and certainly one of the people who shaped our continent. By 1895, he was the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony. He was the major person controlling De Beers, so he controlled the diamonds. He and his friends controlled the gold fields. He also controlled a lot of the fruit orchards in the Cape. So he was a huge, in this day, he would be one of these billionaires we talk about.
Right.
But he had political ambitions. Like I say, he was the Prime Minister of the Cape Colony, but he had created the Rhodesias, which were being governed not by the British Crown, but on behalf of the British Crown by his British South Africa Company. So he had his own private army, and he had his own ambitions to spread British rule across Africa. The famous quote, of course, is Cape to Cairo. So his ambitions at that time included also taking over the Boer republics, which he tried to do in a private enterprise basis, that is, inciting a rebellion and sending his soldiers across, but that ended in a disaster. But you can't look at Southern African history. Of course, there was the subsequent Anglo-Boer War, the creation of the Union of South Africa, today's Republic of South Africa, etc. Rhodes has his hands in everything. Creation of Zimbabwe, creation of Zambia, even the creation of Botswana. He was the first administrator of Botswana Land Protectorate as well. But all this time being a businessman, a major businessman.
Right.
Of course, he was a racist. There's a lot of consciousness about Rhodes today as one of the founders of white supremacy, colonialism, imperialism, atrocities that his company committed and the likes. So, of course, now in many places, particularly in Britain and South Africa, his statues are being pulled down and interrogated and the likes. But he was a nemesis to the three chiefs, that is, Batwain, Khama III, and Sibili in 1895. They went to Britain precisely because they'd seen what Rhodes had done in Zimbabwe, and they wanted to maintain Botswana as we know it today.
So now you are saying in 1895, that's when
1895.
So go ahead.
10 and a half years after the Protectorate was proclaimed.
Okay.
But in between, the other question is, what does a protectorate mean? And it had a legal meaning. And it was refined because of the Dikosi's resistance, particularly Batwane and Sibili, to Rhodes. The Queen had given Rhodes total economic control over the Bechuanaland Protectorate. That is, all the mining rights, all the rail rights, etc. Batwane and Sibili, in the name of their fathers, created concessions which mimicked the concessions that the Queen had given Rhodes. With one important difference. Whereas Rhodes had it on the basis of the Queen being sovereign of the soil of Botswana, right, the crown lands of Bechuanaland Protectorate, they insisted the Dikosi, were sovereigns of the soil. So that created a legal challenge. The Cape's legal counsel to the High Commissioner, Mr. Schreiner, actually agreed with the Dikosi. And this created a bit of a problem. So then the colonial office had to come up with a whole memorandum on protectorates in Africa, define protectorates in Africa. Well, the Foreign Jurisdictions Act, unto which Botswana had been occupied in 1885, was based on the concept that the British could go into a jurisdiction to control their own people, to establish courts for their own people, because they judged the local administration to be, well, in Africa, they used the word uncivilized, but otherwise incapable of meting out justice to their people. So it was protection for British. What the Bramstone memo did, that was the name of the person of this memo, Mr. Bramstone was the drafter, he was legal counsel to the colonial office, was say that because Botswana was a place where an uncivilized jurisdiction where the Dikosi couldn't maintain peace, order, and good government, and so that causing Britain to have to protect its own people, Britain also had to establish courts, et cetera, for the territory as a whole. And because sovereignty is indivisible, the British had sovereign rights to Botswana. So in essence, the British said, we're protecting ourselves from you guys. Yeah, we're protecting white people.
These guys are savages.
Yeah. Well, they said uncivilized. They didn't say
uncivilized.
You get the gist of it.
I'm just thinking right now. I'm just thinking about the book Heart of Darkness. So how Joseph Conrad was actually talking about Africans and naming them savages and all that. So, but go ahead. Yeah.
Yes, he was. Well, maybe we better not talk about Conrad, but
maybe not.
Which was under King Leopold. He had the misfortune or the adventure of working for the Congo Free State of Leopold. King Leopold was very much like Cecil Rhodes. These two people were carving out vast territories in Africa for their own economic and political exploitation. Indeed, they were both rivals, but they ended up, for example, dividing the copper belt between them. So it is very much a direct corollary between what was going on, in that you had private interests creating huge colonies for super exploitation.
Right. So the British were protecting themselves, basically.
That was what
I remember you mentioning that the Botswana did, compared to other nations who were colonized, the Botswana did not even have access to British law.
That's right. And all other protectorates, because the memo that was drafted specifically for Bechuanaland Protectorate was applied to all other British protectorates in Africa, Nyasaland, Northern Nigeria, and the likes. So as British protected persons, Botswana during the colonial era had no right of habeas corpus or British legal rights, whereas a British subject in, say, Sierra Leone, he might not have the vote, he might not have many rights of a British citizen, but he still was supposed to be under the British legal system, or people in southern Nigeria, or even in the Cape Colony. So this came up, and it was confirmed during the time of Sekoma Lecheletsebe's banishment. Sekoma Lecheletsebe was held for years at Habaroni Jail with no charge, because they didn't want him to go back to Ngamiland, because they were afraid if he did go back to Ngamiland, most of the people would rally around him, and that would be a trouble, because they'd put Moremi, I'm sorry, not Moremi, Matiba, son of Moremi, on the throne.
Yeah.
And while there's a complicated royal dispute there, the fact is that Khama was being held without charge for years. But Khama took the case to the Privy Council in London, the highest court of the empire. And they did express some sympathy, but they said, you have no legal standing here. You are a British protected person. So we can't help you.
Wow.
Because all he was asking for was the right of habeas corpus, the most basic legal right in the
Legal
British.
right, yes.
All the way back to the Magna Carta. What was the Magna Carta most remembered for? Establishing the right of habeas corpus, at least for the nobility, and later it cascaded down to British in general, or English in general. Then it was King of England at the time. So Botswana as a protected place, this explains a lot of things that are otherwise not explainable. How could they just kidnap Sechele? I mean, first of all, how could they invite Seretse to Britain and not let him go back? He wasn't charged with anything. There's no crime in marrying Lady Khama or anything else. They just held him with what legality? Nothing, because he wasn't a British citizen. And they had passed something under Khama called the expulsion law. The same thing explains Sibili II. What crime had Sibili II made when he was detained in Mahikeng and then sent to Hansi and told, you can never leave Hansi? It's the same. He had not committed any crime. He was not charged with any crime. Sekeli's brief banishment and then his subsequent banishment during the era of the dispute, both based on the same thing. Mshwajwi, the same thing. Hubuamang, the same thing. Many people face banishment, either internal or external. Most South Africans, if they were judged South Africans and were judged to be making trouble in Bechuanaland Protectorate this time, many of the tribal secretaries were recruited from Mahikeng. They were routinely expelled from the territory and told that you're not allowed here. They were never charged with anything. They were just banished. So, yes, the right of habeas corpus wasn't there. Any legal right that Botswana had was not a right. It had to be conferred. So, yes, they had customary law rights if they were, so-called natives in their tribal territories. But that was superseded by the colonial establishment. And the colonial establishment, the law was whatever the High Commissioner said it was. He had total sovereign rights in the name of the royals, but really this was something that was carried out by the colonial and later the Dominion's office.
Right. That's interesting. So I want to take you back to when the Khosi went to Britain in 1895, right? And I'm curious as to how they were treated when they got there. I know Mama Sedinyana saw them for briefly, maybe for 30 minutes or so, maybe Joseph Chamberlain, Can you talk a little bit about this?
Well, yeah, the audience which they insisted on having with the Queen and was finally granted was, of course, a brief one. It was more a photo op or a courtesy call, is what we would call these things today. So it's had enormous symbolic importance in Botswana in terms of, we talk about protection of Mama Sadinyana. The Dikosi would later on talk about having a covenant basically with the Queen and themselves. And so a whole myth was created in part by Botswana to try to hold on to Protectorate as a shield against being incorporated into South Africa or Rhodesia, as it was then, Southern Rhodesia. However, when the Dikosi went to Britain, they actually were treated pretty well. Obviously not by everybody, but they created a problem for the government.
You think Queen Victoria was excited to see them?
Probably not too much excited, but then she didn't get easily excited.
Exactly.
She didn't know, or she had been advised who Khama was and who these people were. Khama was something of an icon of a good chief.
Yeah, because books were already been written about him, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
And you got to remember, well, first of all, she was a big fan of Livingstone.
The work that Livingstone was doing in South Africa.
Yeah, which had been partially inspired by her and her consort decades earlier. One thing about Queen Victoria, to give credit where credit's due, is she and Prince Albert, her husband, who of course died in the 1860s, they were very much against slavery. And so in that context, and she also was very Christian in her way she looked at the world. And so Christian evangelism slash opposition to slavery on Christian moral grounds was something that was actually in her consciousness, in her ways. And so in that respect, Sibili and Khama were probably a bit more than your average African chief, as they would be called, going through. But still, it was a pro forma type of a visit. They had lunch there, but she was not there to have lunch with them. So it was, as you say, about 30 minutes. They went in there. She gave a small little statement that she's happy that her officials had sorted things out. And she gave them, of course, Bibles and pictures of herself and shawls for the wives, which were part of the tribute she used to get from the Afghans. And they gave her some caresses and the likes, which they'd actually bought in South Africa to prepare for the trip, because it was in a rush. They didn't actually have time to go shoot a lion. So,
and that trip was long to go to the UK, right?
It was. I mean, yeah, it took them about 3 weeks to get from Cape Town to Plymouth. But once they were in Britain, they had things moved very quickly, in the sense that you had the rail system in Britain, which was very efficient then. So they were able to tour Britain up and down. They were in Britain from the beginning of September to the end of November. And much of that time, they had an initial meeting with Chamberlain, who was in charge of the colonies. And he's the one they really had to win over. And he did talk to them for over 2 hours in the first meeting, which had not been planned. His plan was just to sort of brush them off, have them go settle up with Rhodes Company. Then Chamberlain went on a holiday, hoping while he was on a holiday, which was prearranged, he wasn't necessarily avoiding the Decosi at this point, that they would settle, that they'd be pressured to settle. And indeed, the pressure worked, because Sechele, the Barolong Kosi, who also went with them, he was shut out of that meetings. He was shut out in general. He was there to protest the incorporation of British Botswana land, that is south of the Malopo, into the Cape Colony, as well as the Barolong farms. But he ran out of his options, and he left early. He did go there, but he left early. But the Decosi, on the other hand, they had the advantage. They had support of London Missionary Society, was having its centenary at the time, and other groups, and more groups rallied around them, including the fact that powerful men do attract powerful enemies. So Rhodes did have his political enemies in London as well.
Of course.
So anybody who didn't like Rhodes, all the temperance unions, all the missionary societies, the emerging labor movement, lots of these people rallied around the Decosi. They ran a very good public relations campaign. So while Chamberlain was out on his holiday, they ran up and down Britain, speaking in public gatherings, gaining a lot of newspapers, because in those days you had newspapers in every little village and town as well as city. So they would talk to the press everywhere, and it worked. This was an era of media. There was no radios, there was no TV.
So who do you think was more charismatic between the three? Khama, Khama and
Khama was the most famous, so people showed up to see him. But almost all the sources agree that in terms of articulation, Sibili gave the best speeches. But then Sibili had the advantage. He always spoke first anyway, because he was considered senior by both Batswana and Khama. He was presented, and always presented their case at the beginning. But he also had some zingers to start. He would say, David Livingstone used to tell me, little lines like that. Or when I was growing up, David Livingstone taught me this. And of course, we were in a missionary crowd. That down very well.
So they love him for that, though.
Well, I mean, he was not a teetotaler, as you probably know. But during the entire visit, Sibili didn't touch a drop of alcohol. He was on page, on message, on point. So in that sense, he was quite there. But it was Khama who was by far the most famous, because of Hepburn's book and Mackenzie's book, and the
Yeah.
fact that he'd been in the news helping Rhodes conquer the Amandabili, etc.
Mhm.
So it's a combination of those two, which did mean that Batswana was a little bit in the shadow, even though Batswana was the most educated, you could say, if we talk about, time spent in school. He had more time in South Africa.
Yeah.
Khama had the least. So,
Mhm.
he had that advantage. They worked pretty well as a team. Because they were together for 4 months, actually 5 months altogether when we look at traveling through the territory, they got on each other's nerves a bit. There is a wonderful book by Neil Parsons that goes into so much detail. That's why I can say these things.
Yeah.
It's really Neil Parsons scholarship if you really want to go into the details of what they did in Britain.
Mm. So where was the Lin Chui? How come he didn't go?
Well, I mean, he wasn't, of course, he was a different mission society, so he wasn't invited by the LMS. I don't think they would have objected if he had wanted to go. He did give them a petition, and so they did, take note of him. When they went down to Mahikeng, they also, of course, opened up the possibility for the Baralong, who, after some debate, did join them, even though they were of a different mission society. But perhaps the Baralong were more desperate. So I don't think he was barred. But he got lucky, like as did all of Botswana, because I think, if it hadn't been for the Jameson raid, ultimately the whole territory would have probably been transferred. But what the British agreed to was not to transfer Batswana, Khama, and Sibili's territory. So Katling was still very much, it was supposed to be taken over by Rhodes at this point. And Rhodes people used that as a subterfuge. They were trying to explain why are they assembling an army in southeast Botswana for the Jameson raid? And through their newspapers, because they controlled many newspapers, they put out the rumor that they were going to march on Linsway because he was resisting being transferred to the British South Africa Company. So Linsway was an engaged authority. I don't think he was, there was a time when Linsway and Sibili were on different ends in the 1870s, but by this period, they were very much collaborating against the common foe. So I don't think he would necessarily have been barred.
Yeah. So as we progress from 1899 to 1902, there was a war that was taking place, the Anglo-Boer War. How did this affect the stability of Bechuanaland at that time?
It affected it a lot, though, in somewhat different ways in different areas. But the Boers immediately invaded Botswana because it was very strategic to chop the railway to try to divide Rhodesia from Mahikeng, as well as maintain the siege at Mahikeng. So right from the beginning, Bechuanaland was in the fighting. The Dekosi were given a mixed message. It's like, it's a white man's war, but if the Boers come, you should defend your territories. Was the official message. But there were different things happened. Khama mobilized his forces. The Boers eventually backed away from they did come into Hamangwato, but then they retreated in the face of his Mepato, which gave the British a solid base to move south. In the south, Lobatse was seized. At Gaborone was burned to the ground, basically. Well, it was a police camp at this time, but the Boers seized the Gaborone region. Initially, Sibili and the Boers agreed to a line of demarcation, which is, if the Boers don't go west of the railway line, the Bakwena won't go east. But eventually the Boers violated that. So the Bakwena and the Bangweketse, as well as Bakatla, Bahakafela, and Baralong, did take part in the struggle to varying degrees. More logistical support for the British when they came down, but they kept the Boers out of their territories. And with the Baralong and the Bangweketse, they played a very strong role in keeping Mahikeng supplied and helping to break the siege. With the Bakatla Bahakafela at the Battle of Dirdiport, the British ran away, but the Bakatla maintained the attack. And subsequently, the Bakatla raided deep into the Transvaal throughout the war, and used the cattle and other booty that they got. First of all, after the war, they asked for the restoration of their lands from the defeated Boers, but the British didn't go along with that. But Lindstone did use the booty he had collected from the war to buy up a lot of farms, which is the basis for the tribal territories that are there today. When you talk about actual tribal territory land in South Africa at Muraleng and the likes. So it was a major struggle. I'd say the Baralang and the Bahakafela were the most engaged, but the Bangweketsi, Bakwena, and Bangwata played a role.
And so when the Second World War, happened, the British started recruiting this Botswana. Were there any promises made?
Not exactly. First of all, it should be noted that Botswana were very much engaged in the First World War as well.
Okay.
And that shaped their approach to the second, because in the First World War, they had been, there was two ways they were involved. When Boer rebels tried to cross through Bechuana land, at the beginning of World War I, about a third of the South African army rebelled in support of the Germans. That rebellion was crushed, and then many of the rebels tried to get through Bechuanaland to Namibia. And so you had people like Kgosi Sipapiso rounding up some of those Boers. But the experience had been in the military. They had been pushed into South African labor units, not treated properly, not treated as soldiers. So at the beginning of the Second World War, the Botswana, as usual, orchestrated by Sechele, but with Batwain and Kgari and the likes there, refused to allow their people to be recruited. Now, some of their people were recruited anyway, but refused to allow their people to serve in South African labor units, but volunteered to establish a Bechuanaland Corps as proper soldiers in the British Army. Initially, the British were not too eager to do this, afraid they would defend the South Africans. But by 1941, the situation was desperate enough in the British Empire, with the fall of France and the likes, that they agreed to establish the African Pioneer Corps with High Commission forces, that is, Batswana, Basotho, Swati, who would be full soldiers. They would have guns, be trained, and ultimately engaged in combat roles. There was still a color bar. They didn't allow any of them to be officers. They could only be non-commissioned officers. That was the British Empire at that time. But the Dikosi agreed to this. Why did they agree to it? Sechele and Batwain and the likes wanted to underscore their support for Britain as part of their insistence that Britain maintain the Protectorate and keep them away from South Africa, away from the incorporation. But also Sechele and the likes wanted to establish what other African colonies had, which was a permanent military force of Black Africans. And this almost happened because after the war, they established the High Commission Territories Corps, a reduced in number military unit that was supposed to be a permanent unit. But in 1948, the British, under pressure from the newly installed apartheid regime, apparently decided to allow this thing to disappear. I say apparently because I've looked in the PRO for papers on it and they've disappeared, which shocked me. They were just aren't there. So we've got bits and pieces. I only found one file in the entire PRO. I didn't see any, these are still classified, but that may be true. But I did see things where this destroyed. So it seems that I don't know if we'll ever get the full documented, at least, explanation. Maybe we would find more of it in South Africa than in Britain.
Wow. Well, let's talk a little bit about Seretse Khama, because I want to know his role in the Protectorate and in gaining independence. But in one of your writings, you said, at least in one of the studies, that I saw, living in a sovereign Botswana, bordering a free Namibia, had it not been for the blessing of Sechele.
Yeah, what I said is,
and perhaps not.
Yeah, perhaps and perhaps not.
Yeah.
And And that shows the depth of his legacy. We cannot be, supposing South Africa, for example, had succeeded in annexing with UN support Namibia in 1946, and then gone on from there to annex Botswana Land Protectorate. Our whole history might have been very different. Maybe we'd have been part of a South African struggle. Maybe we would have been independent. But Sekedi played such a major role in orchestrating the opposition to the annexation of Namibia, and at the same time asserting Botswana as a sovereign entity, even though we were a protectorate of Britain, but insisting that we were a concerned state, not just we are witnesses, that is, individual Africans coming to testify at the UN, but we are concerned state party on what shall happen to Namibia. And we're saying as a concerned state, so it was the document is called The Case of Bechuanaland, not the case of Sekedi or Kgari. All the 6 of the Dekosi signed this document. Kgari, Batwain II, Moremi III, Gaborone, and the likes. But they were establishing themselves as we are representatives of an entity,
right,
that has standing, locus standing, because that's what the Brits and the South Africans were saying that they didn't have. You don't have locus standing to go to the league. The United Nations. The United Nations is for sovereign countries, member states. But they're saying, no, we're a concerned state party. What did they cite? The UN Charter. And the irony, of course, is one of the major people who authored the UN Charter was Jan Smuts, the South African prime minister, who at that very time was trying to incorporate Namibia, Botswana, Lesotho, and Swaziland as part of his, what he called a Pan-African vision, very different from Kwame Nkrumah's Pan-African or Marcus Garvey's Pan-African vision. But he hoped that post-war, there would be this greater South Africa and a greater Central Africa that might evolve in with South Africa and in East Africa. He advocated the amalgamation of white-run federations as parts of the British Empire to perpetuate the British Empire in Africa in the post-war climate. And his being utterly defeated and humiliated at the UN, because not only was he humiliated on the Namibia question, but the Indians who took up the Botswana and Namibia charge, of course, went after him on apartheid because of the discrimination being suffered by Indians in South Africa. So they also said, we are a concerned state party. And again, India had a seat already in the UN, even though they were not yet independent. But they had seat and status. So now the Indians have taken up this concerned state authority argument and associated themselves with the argument of the Ovaherero Council and the Dekosi Bechuanaland Protectorate. And the UN found against South Africa had no, Britain, which had supported South Africa, then abstained in the final vote. No country voted for South Africa. Then they voted to condemn South Africa on the basis of the Indian complaints. So Jan Smuts, months after he had drafted the charter, he was considered one of the most powerful men in the empire. He was Winston Churchill's right-hand man. There was even a plan that he might take over Britain should Winston Churchill, become unwell or be assassinated or something. He was that powerful in the British Empire. He was on the war cabinet in Britain as well as the prime minister in South Africa. But all of a sudden, he was humiliated at the UN that he had helped to create. Because in part, of course, he didn't understand the winds of change that were happening around him.
Wow, that's fascinating. That's fascinating.
I mean, Sekedi had his faults, and people can debate Sekedi. I've written on the Mshwashwi case and other controversies. But when you look at Sekedi in that context, as the paramount from Ovaherero was saying this weekend, before Nkrumah or any of these people went to the UN, Seretse Khama went to the UN.
Wow. He was just a fascinating fellow.
Yes. Powerful person.
Very powerful guy. Yeah.
I think the two most powerful people of that era before you get to the 1950s with the Nkrumahs and the likes. You've got Haile Selassie, the Emperor of Ethiopia, who obviously stands out. And then who's the next biggest African? Certainly the figure that is listened to throughout the empire. Kgari Khama, punching way above his weight. It wasn't that Bechuanaland was so important to the empire by this time, but Sekedi was a powerful voice within the empire for Africans.
For Africans, you made me want to really do a lot of reading on Sekedi. You know, I guess I have to read a lot of your material. You know, because I know that you have written extensively on Sekedi. You know?
Well, there's the best way is perhaps to read some of his own stuff. Some of it is now online. The case of Bechuanaland can be accessed. But this, I quoted another document which I thought was fascinating. It's in our archives. It must be in British too, where he put together his development plan for Bechuanaland Protectorate in 1945. And it contains a lot of interesting things, some of which were adopted later, and some which we could still perhaps adopt.
Yeah.
But he didn't see political independence as meaningful without economic independence.
Yeah.
But in economic independence, he wasn't necessarily looking for a completely self-sufficient Botswana, but for a Botswana that had economic equity with South Africa and other states in the region.
Yeah. Wow.
And of course, he wanted,
and I think that's the problem that we still have. I think we still lacking, you know, economic independence, I believe, you know, so.
Yeah, well, Sekedi was hoping to do it in 25 years from 1945. If we had succeeded, by 1970, we'd be set, but we're not.
No, we're not. We're not. So let's talk about the events that led to the end of the protection of the Protectorate.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, there was
so we can get to the independence thing in 1966.
One of the things that runs through Botswana, and it's the same in Lesotho and Swaziland, is for a long time nationalist sentiment wasn't really expressed in absolute opposition to the British, because the British protection was seen as a shield for it was a lesser evil, so to speak, to what the real struggle was, which was to stay free of the white supremacist settler regimes in Pretoria and in then Salisbury, today's Harare. So that's also explains why the Dikosi themselves talked about protection and Mamosad and Yana and the compact we had with the Queen and why we want to maintain this marriage with the Queen. The Dikosi in 1908, when they were arguing against Incorporation Union South Africa, they produced rings which they claimed the Queen had given them, which wasn't really true, but it worked. Later on, they had these uniforms. In 1947, you can see them with those very fancy uniforms. They claimed the Queen had given the uniforms to him, as part of the trip. That was not true either, but it was good theater. So these guys knew what they were doing, but it also explains why some of these myths exist now, because they were part of the anti-colonial struggle, but an anti-colonial struggle that was wrapping the Dikosi around the British monarchy and the flag as a shield to not get incorporated into the Union of South Africa in particular. So when can we think about the independence of Botswana from Britain? Only when that recedes. In 1956, it was becoming increasingly clear that Botswana was not, the British were not going to allow the incorporation under their watch of Botswana or Eswatini or Lesotho. And that opened the door for politics. That's when you get LegCo, Reformed African Council, Federal Party, followed by the much more important People's Party and BDP. But then the question then was not, would Botswana be incorporated? Verwoerd in 1963 finally said, we don't want you to incorporate you. But would they be a meaningful independence? Because when Verwoerd was saying, we don't want to incorporate you, but we can help you, he was clearly seeing still that Botswana, Lesotho, and Eswatini can fit into his notions of an apartheid homeland situation. So the question at independence was not so much, would we be able to be independent in South Africa in flag terms and political terms, but would we be actually independent of South Africa, or would we be a de facto Bantustan of the apartheid regime? So the struggle from independence onwards is establishing us as indeed a member of the front line against apartheid, and walking that tightrope between, severe dependence still on South Africa, more than now, but now it's big enough, with political independence. And so, in that sense, we did show political independence in the sense that we could protect freedom fighters moving through our territory, provide an example to the South African regime. Stephen Biko, in his trial, at one point was asked by the judge, "You talk about democracy. Where do Africans have democracy?" He's probably thinking of the likes of Idi Amin. And Biko said, "Just look next door in Botswana with Seretse Khama." So, and Mandela was saying the same thing once in a while when you could get a letter out from Robben Island to Frida Matthews. And the likes of Botswana was indeed doing a great job. Of course, since the liberation of South Africa, more details come out of our very complicated policies with Umkhonto we Sizwe and the likes. Our "we don't see you and you don't see us" policy, as it was described by Thabo Mbeki.
So now, since Seretse Khama was in a big picture now, so, and I'm wondering, from your own research, how the Botswana viewed this type of marriage in 1948, I believe, and also in 1965. I believe that it was after the election victory. Seretse talks about living together harmoniously with white folks.
Well, first of all, Sekedi got along very well with white folks. Sekedi was proud to be African, insisted that Africans, indigenous Africans, be respected, and Bangwato was for Bangwato, that sort of thing. But, one of the reasons Sekedi thought that Seretse should go to Britain for his legal studies, besides polishing up his legal studies, which he thought Wits had not completely prepared him for, was to also experience life in the metropole, the difference of white-black relations in Britain, which were not perfect at the time by any stretch. There was discrimination, of course. Seretse found that even in Ruth's father, in his initial reaction to their marriage. He changed, but in the initial reaction. So Sekedi, when he opposed the marriage, it wasn't really on racial grounds, but the whole thing of how it came about. Race was part of it, in the sense that, there had been relationships of other people, but Seretse was a prince. He was a royal. So Sekedi had those issues. How did the people react? Well, I'm sure they were shocked, but we do know how the Kotla came out and how people rallied around Seretse,
right,
and how they accepted Lady Khama, and that's very well documented, not only in reports and things like that, but also you can look at the photos that were done by Margaret Bourke-White of how the women are just rallying around Lady Khama. They've embraced her. The Bangwato themselves didn't want Lady Khama to leave, and of course, Lady Khama did a lot to earn that, even though she had her own some difficulties adjusting, but she insisted that she have Teboho Jacqueline born in Sorowe, that she had the African doctor deliver. She refused having the white doctors come in. And so she showed her solidarity. She was a remarkable woman too. And so but there's a deeper issue.
I think the Bangwato loved her, though. So
yeah, they did. No doubt about it.
Yeah,
they came to love her, but pretty early on. But also in all of the reserves in Botswana, and I'm not talking about Francistown and Lobatse, which were kind of white settler enclaves, but in the reserves, race relations weren't quite the same. Now, I'm not saying there was no racism, but the few whites and the blacks had to get along in business and in relations, and there were marriages even. The Hirschfelds and the likes. There's famous. So it existed, and it exists in a way that was not possible in the Union, at least not openly possible. So that's part of the background. So I think, Seretse If he was at any time a little bit anti-white, it would have been when he was hanging out with the ANC Youth League at Fort Hare. But I don't know that he was ever anti-white.
Yeah.
He was being brought up by Sechele, by Z.K. Matthews, and other people. And you look at that whole generation, the generation of Mandela and Tambo and the likes. And these are people who I think had a deeper vision, a vision of African empowerment, sure, including racial empowerment, but not in a narrow. I mean, even if we're going to talk about the likes of Sobukwe and Lembende and the likes, these are complex fellows. So they transcend racism, I believe, while asserting, Black consciousness of the time. So I don't think that that's so remarkable. What's remarkable about Botswana is that those values that we got somewhere along the way, which Seretse asserted in 1956, by the way. He said, now I have to paraphrase, but I have this remarkable quote of his in his first speech before the Joint Advisory Council, which of course had some white and black representation. They were debating whether Botswana should think about looking into the Central Africa Federation as a shield against incorporation into South Africa. And Seretse rejected this. And he talked about along the lines, we have ample opportunity in this country to show that, people can live together. In fact, I believe we can show better than other places where who may be more advanced than us in some ways, how human beings can live in harmony together to develop a country. So his non-racial message was there certainly in 1956, clearly articulated as part of his vision of an independent Botswana. And he did have that vision in 1956. He wasn't the only person to have a vision of independence in 1956, but anybody wants to wonder whether Seretse came back, he made it clear, even with the press in Britain, as well as when he arrived here, he was going to be a political figure, and he saw an independent future for this country, and he was going to play a leading role in it. In March of 65,
he won the election. He won the election, right?
And became prime minister for what was then a self-governing Bechuanaland Protectorate, not a fully independent. But at that point, there was just a bit of sovereignty reserved by the Brits. They had the Queen's Commissioner, who had basically the powers of a president. Yeah. But the prime minister was Seretse Khama. There was national development plans. There was a thought that Botswana might need a longer transition, but early in on it, they decided that the Queen's Commissioner is just in the way. That it would be better to just jump ahead. So Botswana and Lesotho did take the decision. And the BDP had already promised that in 1966, we're going to have independence. That is independence next year.
Yeah.
So that's what happened.
Cecil Khama said he was not going to help create an opposition, even though he would love to have it, since it will strengthen up the government. And I'm thinking that every child wants to protect his father's legacy. We saw Ian Khama, the President Ian Khama, in this last election, opting to become the opposition of his father's party.
Yes,
this is history.
Well, sure, and whether you agree with Ski or not, as I'll call him, Seretse Khama, Ian Khama, it is history. You don't have to agree with him to see that he believes that the values of his father are not reflected today in the ruling party. Now, I know plenty of people in the ruling party who wouldn't agree with that, but yes, it is important. I think what's important for everybody is that we maintain the type of tolerance and democracy we've always had in all of our families. And since I'm a Mochwe, I can speak to this as well. We've always had people of all political persuasions. So when the family gets together at Christmas time or whenever, we have all politics in the room, so, and I mean, right now, I've never been a member of a political party here. I've thought about it, but right now I'm just not aligned. But be that as may, even when I've leaned to one party or the other, I've always had a lot of respect for all political parties and political figures. And I don't think I'm unique that way, because when you talk to people like Masiri, who I did used to speak to, I think those, and Mutsumai Impo and the likes, those same values are there, the late Batwain. So that's something that most people do share in this country.
Yeah.
We can see them as opposition, but not our enemies.
Right.
At least the generations that founded our country, that's the way they looked at things. Dr. Khama was ideologically very opposed to Seretse, but he was still, friendly. He
Yeah.
visited him in England.
Oh,
He was a tribesman of
Koma
Seretse.
was one of the really. He was a friendly person, So.
Yeah.
Mhm.
So that's the way we are. I mean, all of those people were friendly
Okay.
people.
Now that we touched a little bit on that, can you take us back to when the diamonds were discovered in Botswana? I think that was in 67.
They were announced in 67. I think
When was this?
they were announced very early in 67. There was the prospecting going on already, and I think we can say with certainty that they were known that there was going to be significant diamonds even just in the months before independence. But there's also texts like, for example, Sekedi in his plan in 1945 lists diamonds as a possible source. But what gets me even more, and what I'm more impressed with, is there's a book called Across the Kalahari that was published in, I think, 1929. And it was by a journalist who had been on the Trans-Kalahari expedition. So he had also published a lot of newspaper articles, which then he amalgamated into a book. And there he describes the fact that, he talks about people talking about diamonds in the Kalahari. And he says that there's no doubt that there's diamonds out there. Why aren't they being exploited? Because it's not in the economic interest of De Beers at that time. They're reserves. Now, I'm not saying that they knew exactly where the diamonds were, but they maintained those concessions. And people realized that there are diamonds. How much? They wouldn't necessarily know that there's these huge kimberlite pipes necessarily at Zhuaneng and at Orapa. Those had to be discovered. But there was a general realization of diamonds in the Kalahari. And for example, Sibili II had a jar full of diamonds in his office. Where did he get them? He claimed people would just bring them from the desert and give it to him.
Really? Wow,
Yeah.
that's interesting.
So I don't think it was a shock, but the time had come. Sure, the timing was good, but in the British period earlier, people for a while knew that there could be these reserves, but they were not being sought for until the 1960s.
But
then how they discovered them, of course, they found diamonds, which is normal in alluvial deposits. That's long rivers, some diamonds. But they tracked the river to the kimberlite pipe. When you look at diamonds in a place like Sierra Leone, or most diamonds for most of history were just scattered diamonds here and there at riverbeds. That's how that's how you find diamonds in Sierra Leone today in a lot of places. Kimberlite, named because the first one they really discovered was at Kimberley, is where you find high concentration of diamonds in certain parts of the world. Initially in South Africa, of course, here in Botswana and parts of Russia, Tanzania. So, those kimberlite pipes were discovered in the 60s, but people were becoming aware of them right at the eve of independence. So Oppenheimer was meeting with Seretse when he was still prime minister.
So the share that was given to Botswana government at that time, I don't think it was fair. What do you think of that? Because obviously it wasn't 50-50. But I'm amazed at the development that came out of what we got. Because we were able to build schools and roads and clinics and all that kind of infrastructures.
Yeah. Well,
But
I mean,
I don't think the share was fair enough.
Perhaps not. First of all, it wasn't initially 50-50, became 50-50 supposedly. Botswana became a 50-50 operation in the 1970s. And I think that if we confine ourselves to Botswana, that's what it was, a 50-50 breakdown. But there's more to the diamond value chain than the mining.
Exactly.
So in that context, it took us a long time. And I would go along to a great degree with Mahang and the likes in their criticism. It took us a longer time than maybe we should have to climb up the value chain. And by the time we did, maybe it was too late. I mean, we did eventually get the Central Selling Organization to come to Gaborone, but that was only in the Mohai era. So you can have those debates, and they're important debates to have. I think it's very important that all Botswana know a lot more about diamonds, since diamonds, even today, even though they're going to be a declining asset, they're still going to be an important asset to our country in the coming years. And I must say, I'm a bit disappointed again that we don't really teach this properly. And it's just like we don't teach history. I don't think we teach, mining. Diamonds are paying for everything. What do we know about diamonds? I think the basics should be taught to, so that people coming out of secondary school have some idea, how are diamonds marketed, what do we mean by Botswana, what's Botswana's relationship to De Beers, etc. Now, one thing about it is, De Beers had its advantages in that it created for many years, no longer, but for many years it upheld an almost perfect cartel. When the Arabs were struggling to have a cartel for their oil, or the copper producers for their copper in South America and Zambia, Zaire, and the likes, De Beers was controlling 80% of the diamond trading in the world. And that meant that they could fix the price. That's why diamonds are more valuable than rubies or emeralds. It's not because of rarity or anything else than De Beers and its marketing. So there was a big challenge to that in 1982, and Botswana and the Soviet Union and De Beers in South Africa and a few others cooperated together to take down rivals who probably let me just say, they had the backing of the Americans, but definitely Australia, Zaire, as it was then DRC, and the likes, were trying to break up the cartel with American urging. And Botswana and the likes fought back. And for a while, for 1 year, we didn't sell our diamonds. We stockpiled them. Later on, we cashed those in for the 15% of De Beers. So it's a very complicated story. It's a lot of debate can be in, but I find it interesting that the Soviet Union, Botswana, and under the table people in South Africa in the apartheid era were working together against the Americans and their cohorts to maintain the diamonds at a high value. So these are some of the stories that need to be talked about post-independence too.
Yes.
As well as our role in frontline states and the likes.
Yeah. But because of time, you have worked under 4 presidents, at least, from President Masiri up to now, right?
Well, for Masiri, I did projects. I wasn't a civil servant, but I was in Sududu task force, other task force, and we got along. And later I worked with him when he was in retirement, because his office was still under Office of the President. So yes, I've worked with Masiri, of course, with Mohai. I was his deputy senior private secretary as well as press secretary. Khama, I tried to do communications coordination. That was somewhat frustrating. And I was working for Masisi, not only in the first months of his presidency, but he was my minister. And then when he was vice president, but for a long time, he was my minister, and we did work closely together. So yes.
They have different leadership styles, right?
They definitely do. They definitely do. But I like them all.
You like them all, okay.
Well, I mean, I won't say who I like better, but I mean, I think, and I'll be frank, I'm disappointed in some of the things that are happening now, but otherwise, I certainly think that our presidents in the past have done a great job. overall in terms of the tolerance that they have projected. And I say that even about Ian. Some people want to criticize him on that, but that's not the ski that I know. I'm not saying that any of them are above criticism. I myself, having worked with them, have plenty of criticisms of all of them. But I will say also that Masiri is a particular hero of mine. I think he is very underestimated, and in many ways is the founder of modern Botswana, along with Seretse. And that their partnership is absolutely crucial to putting the country on the right path.
Dr. Ramsey, I was listening to a professor out of Cornell this past week when they were discussing the Queen Elizabeth II, and then they were talking about the Commonwealth, which was established I believe in 1884. That there's some countries like Kenya and Botswana that are still part of Commonwealth, even though they have a nasty legacy. So your thought on that? Should they continue to be part of the Commonwealth or not?
Well, for the time being, I'm not very much opposed to it, but I'm not very wedded to it. But the reason why the Commonwealth survives is it has evolved. And as if you look at the modern Commonwealth, and when I say modern, even the Commonwealth since 1966, it is one place where leaders could get together and discuss serious issues and even make a serious impact, particularly if we're talking about negotiations for the decolonization of Zimbabwe, for example, putting pressure on South Africa and the likes. And when we talk about the Commonwealth during the time of Queen Elizabeth, and particularly since the 1960s, we're talking about a Commonwealth dominated by Caribbean, African, and Asian countries. We're not talking about the old British Empire with the dominions of Australia, Canada, Britain, Union of South Africa under white rule. We're talking, those countries remained in it, except for South Africa during the 1960s. So we're talking about an organization that, because it's a little bit informal, that because it brings a lot of people together, diverse religions, the largest Muslim populations in the world are in the Commonwealth, some of the largest Christian populations, all races are in the Commonwealth, developed and underdeveloped and middle developed countries are in the Commonwealth, Asia, Africa, Caribbean, Europe in the Commonwealth. That's what makes it unique and potentially an important and positive organization. If it ceases to do that, if its conversations become, stale or useless, then there's no particular purpose. I certainly have no personal desire to perpetuate the British Empire in any way, but I don't think the Commonwealth is the British Empire in 2022.
Understandable. Your message of hope in regard to independence, and also I would like to know how you like to be remembered now, and even after you can no longer do this marvelous work that you are producing.
Well, I don't know. The most important thing is I hope my children will remember me well, because the most important job in my life starts with being a father. But,
I like that.
Yeah, otherwise, what can you say? I'm not a fan of Frank Sinatra, but I do like the song My Way. You've got to live your own life, find your own way in life. And if you can do that, you have to be comfortable in your own skin. And then what others say and think about you, who knows? They may decide that we're very stupid. There's this criticism now that people who are so-called woke are judging the past people by present-day standards. God knows what they'll judge us by, But I'm comfortable in my own skin, so it'll be okay.
Thank you, Jeff.
You're welcome. It's been a pleasure.
It has been a wonderful 1 hour, 20 minutes.
Okay, time flies.
Yeah.